Hello, I'm Toycat, and one of the very few things that almost all countries have in common is having to choose a capital city. You need a seat of government, you need a place to rule your country from, and for most countries the decision is easy. If you live in a blue country, you decided that you could solve this problem by just having your largest city be your capital. But you might be surprised to learn that there are countries in orange which haven't decided this way. They have decided that their capital city should not be their largest, and it's weird because there are so many capital cities that are just ubiquitous with that country, but this is not the case for many of these nations, which even started in many places with the capital being the largest, like Pakistan and Karachi, before moving the capital to the other side of the nation. With Australia, they did a similar thing. They started with two separate cities, both vying to be the capital, and then compromised by picking a city no one has heard of that's very hard to get to, and a similar decision was made in South Africa, except the compromise is even weirder here because they picked three cities, all of which aren't the largest. Why do countries pick capital cities in the places that they do? Surely you would want to make the same decision no matter where you are in the world, except I would actually say there are three different phases to being a country: the early game, the mid game, and the late game, and each of these phases requires picking a slightly different capital, and I'll explain exactly why today, and maybe you'll even decide by the end that your country should move their capital. With that said, this is the fundamentals of geography, and the first and easiest category to target is all of these countries in blue. It's really easy to work out why you would want to have your largest center of population also be your capital, and that's because that's where the largest number of people are nearby, and that's where the easiest access to government services and all of that stuff would be done, right? Except there's a little bit of reverse correlation that's mixed in on this map, because some countries such as Spain and Mexico picked their capital city and then it happened to grow into the largest, partially because of government influence. And then there are cases such as London, Paris, or Dublin or Stockholm, where the largest city kind of formed in a natural place and the government then joined there later, or at least in the modern sense of the former government. And so Stockholm's the capital of Sweden, Stockholm, is very far to the south and east of the country. To a lesser extent, this is true in Poland, and so if you look at capital cities, you can see that they're never going to be perfectly centered if you just pick them as the largest city, because the largest city seemingly just forms in random places. It's in the south of the UK, but the north of France. What's the deal with this? Well, actually, it's not entirely random. Where cities form is actually quite methodical, because you need to have access to resources, and the most easy to access resource that is most freely accessible is that of water. The reason so many Parisians exist, at least in the old sense of the city, is the fact that you have access to a giant river. That means that the amount of drinking water isn't going to run dry, but also it means as long as you set up your sewage on the downstream from where you're drinking from it, you have access to a way to get one of the most fundamental needs of humans, as well as to deal with one of the other ones, and this makes it a great place to set up, basically regardless of anything else. And so this is one of the early game advantages that cities like London and Paris have. Indeed, when we look at Vienna, you'll see that this too is on a river. It's on the river, the Danube River, and similarly, if we look at, say, Frankfurt, this is a fairly large city. The full name of Frankfurt is actually Frankfurt am Main, or Frankfurt am Main, I guess if you're going to say it in German, and that's because it's on the Main River, the Main River if you're feeling German, and that is fun because if you are German, you know you have to call it Frankfurt am Main, because otherwise it might get mixed up with Frankfurt am der Oder, which is on the Oder River, all the way on the other side of the country. What's fun about this is the fact that Newcastle is a city in the UK with a similar problem. Everyone just calls it Newcastle, but technically it's Newcastle upon Tyne, and that's because the river is such an important part of most cities that actually this is named after the river that you'll never guess the name of. And yeah, this is something that is true for many cities. I guess another famous example could be Stoke-on-Trent. There are lots of cities which have to be on rivers, and this is one of the biggest early game advantages that you can have as a group of people, and this is where people generally tend to flood into. However, it doesn't explain the kind of mid-game of picking a capital, and this is when countries as we start to know them are going to be formed, because again, if you are picking a capital city, you're not really picking it, you're just being like, okay, here is where the people are, here's where we're logically going to control a place from. You might be thinking on very basic military strategy in terms of land, but you don't really need to consider the water, for most of history at least, but water becomes a great resource not just for conquering other nations, but also at the exact same time, water becomes a resource that allows you to trade freely. Do you know how much work it takes to build a road? If you're in Mexico City, which by the way, just a fun fact, as a capital, it's sinking, going for a lot of issues, they're wondering about whether they should relocate their capital away from there, but anyway, Mexico City is sinking. Do you know how much it costs to build a road from here to another city in Mexico, or a road from here to, say, the United States or to Guatemala? It's very expensive. You have to pave the entire thing, you have to maintain it. It does have huge costs for everyone involved, whereas the ocean is free, which means that, if you want to send soldiers into another country, you don't have to build a road or a rail first. You can just put them on a boat and send that boat over there, something which I believe the UK might have done a little bit of at some point in the past. Again, not a video about empires, but it is here to say that having access to free trade, more or less, because of the ocean, and having access to lots of water makes for a great location. This is one of the things that makes Singapore such a beneficial location. Singapore is obviously the capital of its own city-state, so it's a little bit of a messy one to name here, but you'll notice how most of the countries in this area are generally formed, if not directly onto the ocean, a very, very, very short distance away. Look at Kuala Lumpur, and London's one of its big advantages is being so close to it. It's on a river that very quickly turns into an estuary, that very quickly turns into the sea. This is something that also benefited the Swedish Empire and the Portuguese Empire, and you can basically say that if you have a capital that's on the ocean, you probably have easier access to trade or conquest, both things which you want in the middle phase of development. And so when you look at the mid-game of countries, you can see a lot of countries starting to think tactically, not just about how they can, I guess, maybe go offensively with their position, get a lot of trade in, but also how they can be quite defensive about it. So interestingly, if we go to New Zealand, you can find Wellington, which is the capital, even though Auckland is the largest city. And the reason they chose this is quite easily described by looking at the geography, but instead of me describing it, how about I let the Wellington government website, this is the Wellington City Council, explain it for you, because they say that Wellington became New Zealand's capital in 1865, and this was something that happened because they used to have a government in Auckland, but a panel of Australian-based land commissioners designated Wellington the seat of government due to its favourable geography, sheltered harbour, and central location. So there are two separate things notable there. One of these is having a sheltered harbour. Instead of being accessible to the world, instead it kind of takes advantage of that access, but using a little bit of defensibility. Having this small trench right here means that it's very easy to stop enemy boats coming in using from the land. Basically, if you have the land already, you have an advantage in maintaining the land from sea-based defense, but also you can go out very freely. But also the central location is another key thing to note. Wellington was picked as the capital because it's fairly central in the grand scheme of New Zealand, especially compared to Auckland. Being central is great because people feel like they need to be near their major seat of government, and there are some countries where it goes really wildly the opposite way. I mean, Beijing is nowhere near most of China, Moscow is nowhere near most of Russia. You can be thousands of kilometers from your seat of government, but in general, it helps a lot of people to feel like they have a connection to their government, and it helps the government to do the opposite, to maybe impose their will on people or to have a functioning country, depending on how you want to describe that one. But this is what the mid-game is all about. It's about having easy access to the world, but making sure the world doesn't have easy access to you. Interestingly, Moscow actually wasn't the capital of Russia for a bit. St. Petersburg was deliberately picked on the Baltic Sea, and this is the same sort of situation. You can see it's going to be easily defensible, but at the same time, it allows Russia to have a port, one of the very few parts of the world where they can do that, because interestingly, Russia is a giant country, but only has warm water ports all the way on the east here, or all the way in this questionably controlled territory to the west. It's very, very hard for Russia to actually access the ocean, and that's one of the key reasons that you can cite for why Russia's GDP is much lower than most of the rest of Europe's. And indeed, the reason that most Central European countries have their capitals where they are is because they're on a fairly large navigable river, which gives them a similar benefit of access to the ocean, just of having to go through other countries. This is a huge, this is the opposite of a boon for countries like Ethiopia, where, as you can see, Ethiopia has its capital quite inland, and theoretically you can get from Addis Ababa to the rest of the world, but you need to go through the port of Djibouti, or you need to go through Eritrea, or you need to go through Somalia, and I don't know if they're necessarily a great partner to deal with right now, and this is a big problem. Having access to the ocean is great, being inland has benefits, being central has benefits, but really you want to have both of those things at the same time, something which Wellington has, but something which Ethiopia does not. And so now we should move into the late game of things, because I think in the mid game it's very, very clear having resources is great. Those resources can come internally, those resources can come externally from the world, but resources start to become more and more important in the mid to late game of phase of things, because as the world industrialized in a very serious way, having the ability to have a bunch of iron ore or coal or things that you can turn into more finished products is the way that you are going to be able to create things that the world wants. I think, Australia is a famous exporter of resources, but also the reason that the north of England started to grow so much during the Industrial Revolution is because of their easier access to those raw resources. In the same way that in the early game, the resource you want the most is water and food, because those are the lowest needs. As you start to require things like wool, and as you start to require things like metal, having easy access to a mine becomes very important, and so hilly areas actually start to become pretty useful in the same way that, I guess you could say lots of countries in certain belts of the world are more useful for their coffee, their copper, or their natural earth resources now. Having these resources is very handy. If you have all of the resources that you need for a product, that is how it works. One of the key benefits of the United States is the fact that it is so large and just so happens to have so many resources of basically every type that people want, and then the easy ability to export them, but we'll talk more about rivers some other time. For now, let's talk about the late game of capitals. Where should you have a capital if you were to start one in the last 100 years or so? The answer kind of depends on your country's specific geography, or as always, but I think it's worth looking at a few particular case studies, the first being that of the United States. They have a larger city which is on the world stage for how large it is, and then they picked Washington, which is a mid-sized city on the East Coast, not even one of the top three really. And so why is it that they picked this as their capital? National unity. Having a big country is quite hard, and if you're Russia, you can just say, yep, the country's ruled from the other side, and that's just how it is. If you're China, you can say, yep, you're ruled by a bunch of people from a fairly different ethnicity on the other side of the country, but that's just how things are. What are you going to do about it? And if you're the United States, one of the ways you do this is you say, look, we're compromising on our capital. Back when the country was just made of eastern states, a lot of people in the South felt like New York was a northern capital, and so they compromised on a capital to the east. The same is true for Canada, Ontario, and Quebec. They were both the major centers of Canada. They compromised at Ottawa, which is more or less in between them. It's technically in Ontario, but it kind of expands into Quebec. And a similar thing was done in Australia with Victoria and New South Wales. They were both fighting for the capital, and so they made a neutral capital territory called Canberra. You can tell a constructed capital, by the way. This is something that's smart, because in the modern age, we don't just need resources, right? You need to have a place where legislators and people of government and business and industry all want to actually be located. You want to attract talent to a location, and that means that you need to have not just natural resources in the pretty sense of it, but you need to have very good architecture and buildings and all the things that people need for day-to-day life, roads, houses, etc. And so one of the best ways you can do that is by building this from scratch. As you can see, the Canberra is one of the most ridiculously artificially created cities ever. They're like, we're building a new city, so let's make it on not a grid, but a circle, whereas as you can see with Islamabad, this is a fairly new constructed city too. You can see they went for a very, very gritty approach, incredibly gritty. Being able to build a city from scratch is a huge benefit, and if you are, say, London, and you want to build a nicer area for your politicians, it's much harder to create new projects there, because you've got people who have hundreds of years of connection to a place who don't want have their house demolished so they can build a new road through it, or build a new sewer pipe through it, or build a new whatever else. And so building new infrastructure is hard, and building things that people want and building that is fairly tricky. You just have to rely on it already existing or converting something that's already there. Whereas if you want to be Brasilia, you can build a, which is obviously the capital of Brazil, then you've got the fairly easy game of just, yeah, you go in and you build whatever you want, you make nice wide avenues, you do all the things that city planners say they wish they could do from the very beginning, and you just get it done. Look how insane some of these capital cities look. Basically, the late game of a capital city is, yeah, obviously being defensible is nice, war is bad, and trying to avoid a country being able to attack you is easy. But even though Caracas is right here, not that far in from the ocean, Venezuela isn't that realistically concerned about an invasion, right? If they were concerned about an invasion, they could take some precautions, but what they should be more concerned about is the well-being of their people. I mean, yeah, what they should be concerned about is the well-being of their people. Colombia, as you can see, it's the same thing. Every single country can be concerned about defense, but the much larger concern on a day-to-day basis is how do you make a good city? And the easiest way to make a good city is you start from scratch. At least that's the opinion of many countries around the world. Is that the actual correct way to make a city? I think this kind of depends on your viewpoint. Is something great because it has years of history like that of Tokyo? Is it great because it's got this patchwork of hundreds or thousands of years of local governments being replaced by this, by that, and things building on top of each other? I'm going to pick a random street in Tokyo and say, is this beautiful? Is this beautiful, I ask you? To me, I think there is a beauty to be found in old mixing up to new, but you might say, no. When you do that, you end up with messes like that of Jakarta, which is being seriously considered as being moved as the capital, because when you go into Jakarta, it looks like this in some places, and I don't think this is actually a bad neighborhood, but, when you get a city which builds badly from the beginning, it gets very expensive to fix previous mistakes, and so why not just start again? Every country has plenty of land, and so why shouldn't the UK or Ireland or Sweden just make a new capital? I mean, we already have a city which is doing well by itself. If the government resources are going to be going to a place anyway, politicians' salaries and civil servant salaries, why not just build a new city wherever you feel like it? If you want, you can see this as one of two solutions to a problem. Either you can say that politics adds a certain amount of money to an economy, and so why not use it to boost an area which is doing poorly? This is an argument happening in the US a lot right now. The Midwest is kind of dying out because of the lack of auto manufacturing. Why not move government industries out there? Or you could say, wait, no, we need to move government industries where the smart people are that want to work for them. And, you could say that the government money only works because you have people who are willing to do the things that government needs to get done. And so, yeah, is the government an added industry, or is it one that takes away from a country? Is it one that requires some people who otherwise would be working somewhere else? I guess it's an endless question without a particularly decent endless answer, but it is one worth thinking about. In the modern era, you can locate your capital wherever you want, but you do need infrastructure. You do need it to be a place where politicians want to live, and you do need it to be a place where I guess people more broadly for the government need to want to live, and that is something worth considering. You know what else is worth considering? The fact that this has been the fundamentals of geography. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I think we'll definitely have to do a part 3 on rivers next week, because for now, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I want to be honest with you, unlike some politicians who want to have nice cities for themselves, and maybe unlike some YouTubers who say like, oh yeah, give me some money, really help out the channel, pay for the budget, I am very honest. If you give to my Patreon, I will use the money exclusively for kebabs. But if you want to help out the channel, get a couple of exclusive city guesser videos, then you can go over there right now and you can show your support, and I will use it to buy some weird beverage at some point this month. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Probably. Second channel, don't care. Bye.